Hello and welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be exploring the profound cultural and psychological aftermath of colonialism. You see, we're going to uncover how the historical map isn't just drawn with borders and treaties, but with words, stories, and deeply embedded psychological narratives. It's fascinating stuff, so let's get right into it. Before we jump into the deep end, I want to acknowledge our source material. The rich academic foundation for today's Explainer actually comes from an incredibly detailed, academically rigorous podcast structured as a Q&A between avatars of theorists Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak. And all of that brilliant analysis is directly rooted in the comprehensive study material prepared by the Department of English at Odisha State Open University. Their rigorous curriculum on colonial encounters is exactly what allows us to unpack these incredibly dense theories today. Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to think about something. Who actually gets to write history? Is the history you know the objective truth, or is it, well, a narrative meticulously crafted by the people who held all the power? For centuries, the story of the world was written almost exclusively by the colonizers, leaving the colonized entirely out of the script. To peel back the layers of this constructed reality, we're going to be looking at 5 key areas: the colonial hangover, Fanon's psychology, Said's Orient, Bhaba's messy middle, and finally, Spivak's subaltern. Starting off with Section 1, the colonial hangover. So when the flags of the empire finally came down, the cultural and psychological structures of colonialism, they didn't just vanish overnight. And that brings us to post-colonial theory. Basically, it's a critical framework meant to dissect those lingering cultural and political dimensions, specifically looking at how they show up in literature and texts. You see, post-colonial literature emerged primarily from places fundamentally altered by imperialism. We're talking about the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Writers from these regions essentially started using literature to reclaim the voices that had been silenced or violently distorted by colonial domination. Now, absolutely central to this erasure is the concept of otherness. And I want to be clear, this wasn't just a casual prejudice. It was a highly systemic process. Colonizers purposefully defined colonized peoples as fundamentally different, as the other, and by default, inferior. This sense of otherness was completely weaponized in literature and culture to deny colonized populations their agency. It was their way of creating a moral justification for imperial rule. The scholar Abdul John Muhammad actually called this the Manichaean allegory. Think of it like a rigid, totalizing binary. On one hand, the colonizer paints the West as rational, masculine, and inherently good. On the other hand, they frame the East or the Orient as chaotic, feminine, and evil. This incredibly destructive binary thinking dehumanized vast, diverse populations, reducing really complex and dynamic cultures to mere caricatures. Let's move on to Section 2, Fanon, Psychology of Oppression. Understanding that brutal psychological reduction naturally leads us to our first major thinker, Frantz Fanon. Born in Martinique in 1925, Fanon was this towering intellectual and a psychiatrist who witnessed the visceral horrors of the Algerian War of Independence firsthand. His work forces us to confront a deeply intimate psychological trauma of oppression. In his seminal work, The Wretched of the Earth, he makes a profoundly striking argument. He states that colonialism is a system so toxic, it dehumanizes literally everyone it touches, both the colonized and the colonizer. The system strips humanity away universally, just replacing it with a structure of violence and exploitation. And Fanon's insights went even deeper into the mind. In Black Skin, White Masks, he exposed the agonizing reality that colonized people often internalize these racist stereotypes. They're quite literally conditioned to believe in their own inferiority. He also sounded a really early alarm about neocolonialism, warning us that, hey, even when a nation achieves political independence, the economic and cultural subjugation by former colonizers often just seamlessly continues. So Fanon showed us the internal scars. But how were these stereotypes globally broadcast in the first place? I mean, think about the movies you've seen or the classic books you've read. Have you ever noticed how the East is portrayed? Often as this mystical, backward, or even dangerous place, right? Well, as we'll see, that's definitely not an accident. This takes us to Section 3, said, Inventing the Orient. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how that deliberate framing was totally exposed by Edward Said, a brilliant Palestinian-American intellectual. In 1978, he introduced the concept of Orientalism, which honestly practically founded post-colonial studies as we know it today. I want you to notice the crucial use of the word construction here. Said revealed that these Western representations of the East weren't just innocent creative choices or, simple misunderstandings. They were a deliberate construction, a tool manufactured specifically to paint the East as an exotic, backward counterpart to justify political and military domination. Drawing heavily on the philosopher Michel Foucault, Said proved a rather terrifying point. Knowledge is intricately linked to power. Western academic and literary traditions weren't just neutral observers sitting on the sidelines, they were active participants in imperialism. By controlling how the East was known and studied, the West essentially controlled the East itself. But wait, if the West held all this narrative power, it really begs the question, are colonized cultures just passive victims of this storytelling? Is the power of the colonizer truly absolute and unshakable? Let's find out in Section 4, Bhaba, the messy middle. So to answer that question, absolutely not. The thinker Homi K. Bhaba, who was born in Mumbai, takes us away from these simple binaries and introduces a real game changer, the concept of hybridity. This is the idea that when cultures collide under colonialism, they don't just stay in their separate corners. Instead, they merge, they transform, and they create entirely new cultural forms. Bhaba saw this hybridity as incredibly powerful because it disrupts that rigid us versus them binary we talked about earlier. It proves that colonial power is never absolute. It always involves negotiation. Let's look at how this builds into everyday resistance. Bhaba talks about mimicry. When the colonized imitate the culture or language of the colonizer, it's never a perfect copy, right? It's, as he puts it, almost the same, but not quite. And this actually creates deep anxiety for the colonizer because it mocks their authority from within. This whole dynamic happens in what Bhaba calls the third space, a completely new site of meaning where colonial power is questioned, subverted, and ultimately reshaped.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Spivak and the Subaltern.
So Bhaba shows us resistance in the messy middle, but what about the people at the very bottom? Our final theorist, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, born in Calcutta, forces us to look at the subaltern. Borrowed from Antonio Gramsci, this term refers to those who are completely marginalized and totally excluded from hegemonic power structures. Spivak is urging us to look at the people whose voices are erased, not just by the colonizers, mind you, but sometimes by the elite classes of their own newly independent nations. So the crucial point is captured perfectly in her most famous 1988 essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Spivak delivers this fierce, absolute critique of well-meaning Western intellectuals who constantly try to speak for the marginalized. She argues that by acting as these saviors or translators of subaltern experiences, intellectuals often just end up silencing those very groups all over again. Spivak really demands that we look at intersections. You literally cannot understand the subaltern experience without looking at how gender, race, and class collide, particularly for women in the global South. She strongly critiques the idea that Western feminism can just be universally copy-pasted onto, say, a rural woman in India. Their lived experiences are vastly different. For Spivak, true empowerment doesn't come from imposing Western frameworks from above, but through genuine, localized education and, above all, actually listening. Bringing it all together, what these four incredible thinkers, Fanon, Said, Bhaba, and Spivak, teach us is that literature and culture are a battlefield. Literature serves as both a site of brutal oppression, but also as a vital tool for resistance. They give us the vocabulary we need to recognize enduring historical trauma, and more importantly, to celebrate the creative, stubborn resilience of marginalized people finally reclaiming their own stories. Which leaves us with a final question to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. The empires might have fallen, but the structures, they remain. So where do you still see this colonial hangover operating in our global economic and cultural systems today? Look closely at the media you consume, the histories you read, and the voices that are amplified. This post-colonial journey isn't just history, folks. It's happening right now. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack these powerful ideas and keep questioning the narrative.